Hello, welcome to all. How are you? My name is Tim McDermott. I am the event manager here at Duke Science and Society. I want to thank you for joining us for the fourth now. I'm losing track of time, the fourth installment of our coronavirus conversations here. And so just a few housekeeping notes before I hand it over to myself as I'm the moderator for today's conversation. The chat is open, and I encourage you to share. With me your questions that you might have for our guests as we move forward, and we will try and get to as many of them as possible. The other thing is, if we experience any technical difficulties along the way, please be patient with us. If you get kicked out of the meeting, all you have to do is return to the email that we sent out, and you can use that link to log back in and join us again. So as you can see, we have all our guests on here. And so I am just going to do a brief introduction, give names and titles, and then we're going to get underway with this great conversation. First, Tracy Manning is the Assistant Professor of Theater Arts and the Artistic Director at Taylor University Theater. Tracy is also a friend and my own theater director when I was in college. So let's see if we can get her unmuted here. And there she is. Welcome, Tracy.
Thanks, Tim.
Next up, we have joining us together Dr. Priscilla Wald, who is the R. Florence Brinkley Distinguished Professor of English and an affiliate faculty with the Duke Science and Society. Welcome, Dr. Wald.
Hi. Good to be here.
It's good to have you. And joining her is Dr. Joseph Donahue. He's a professor of the practice in the Duke English Department, and I would say prolific poet, judging by your publication history, but I don't know if that's the right word. But thank you for joining us, Dr. Donahue.
Thank you very much. It's fun to be here.
And finally, last but not least, Dr. Ariana Ely is a postdoc with the Duke Science and Society, and she focuses in science communication, as well as working with the Duke STEAM initiative, the Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math. That is a mouthful. As well as hosting a really excellent podcast, which I guess we'll say is furloughed, Ariana?
Yep.
Yeah,
right.
Unfortunately, it's on college basketball, which is not something we can enjoy right now, but that's okay because there are other things. So I want to jump right in, and I asked everyone to bring a piece of art, be it visual, a poem, a quote, whatever it is that strikes them as particularly life-giving and beautiful in this time. And so we'll start, and I will actually start so that I don't have to go last. And we'll go to Tracy after me, and Dr. Wald and Dr. Donahue, and then to Ariana. So my piece, I actually have two pieces, so I cheated, but I'm the host. So the first piece is a James Taylor lyric from the song Shed a Little Light. And it really struck me as I was listening to it last night. And the lyrics are, "Let us turn our thoughts today to Martin Luther King and recognize that there are ties between us, all men and women living on the earth, ties of hope and love, sister and brotherhood, that we are bound together in our desire to see the world become a place in which our children can grow free and strong. We are bound together by the task that stands before us and the road that lies ahead. We are bound and we are bound." And the reason that this particular piece has struck me as being so life-giving is it reminds us that we can't defeat this alone. And right now, being so far socially distant from everyone, it's hard to remember that we are bound together with a common sense of humanity. And so that lyric has reminded me of that. It has provided me with some solace. And then the other thing, last night I watched the movie version of Noise is Off, which is a great play by Michael Frayn. Michael Caine, Christopher Reeves, and Tracy, help me out. The woman, red hair, I lost her name, plays the nurse, the housekeeper in it. In the movie. Do you remember her name? Carol Burnett.
Carol Burnett.
It was wonderful to belly laugh at something. It was wonderful to just sit there and just uproariously laugh at something happening. And it was a catastrophe, right? The movie is all about a catastrophe. So to be able to laugh at a catastrophe is wonderful. So I've taken up enough time. Tracy, please, what is giving you life? What is fueling your artistic endeavors right now?
I think I appreciate being asked to bring something. I have to probably own at the outset that I feel that I'm looking every day for something to fuel my artistic sensibilities. And it's probably changing every day. Sometimes it's a piece of music, sometimes it's a piece of art, a line from a play or a poem. I feel a little in a drought artistically, honestly. The places where I create and work are, to use the word that's floating around in our universities and places these days, is on furlough. Um, so this morning it was a poem. So I brought that because that's what it is today. It's by Joy Arho, who's our first Native American to be Poet Laureate of the United States. And it's her poem, The Life of Beauty. Do you want me to read it?
Please read it.
Okay. The sung blessing of creation led her into the human story. That was the first beauty. Next beauty was the sound of her mother's voice, rippling the waters beneath the drumming skin of her birthing cocoon. Next beauty, the father with kindness in his hands as he held the newborn against his breathing. Next beauty, the moon through the dark window. It was a rocking horse, a wish. There were many beauties in this age, for everything was immensely itself. Green, greener than the impossibility of green, the taste of wind after it slide through a dew grass at dawn, or language running through a tangle of wordlessness in her mouth. She ate well of the next beauty. Next beauty planted itself urgently beneath the warrior shrines. Next was beauty beaded by her mother and pinned neatly to hold back her hair. Then how tendrils of fire longing grew into her, beautiful the flower between her legs as she became herself. Do not forget this beauty, she was told. The story took her far away from beauty and the test of her living. Beauty was often long from the reach of her mind and spirit. When she forgot beauty, all was brutal. But beauty always came to lift her to stand again. When it was beautiful all around and within, she knew herself to be corn plant, moon, and sunrise. Death is beautiful, she sang as she left this story behind her. Even her bones, said time, were tuned to beauty. And I think for today, that kind of stanza where she talks about how in the test of her living, beauty was often long from the reach of her mind and spirit, has resonated with me in this space. And at the same time, daily opportunities to engage with beauty and talk about beauty like this panel and other things comes to lift me to stand again. So that's what it is for today.
That's beautiful. Thank you so very much. I'm going to unmute Dr. Wald here. And let's see if it's, yeah, there we go. Dr. Wald, please share with us what you've brought.
Actually, since I brought something that's a little bit different, I think Joe's going to go first. And
Excellent.
then I'm taking a different turn.
Excellent. Dr. Donahue, please.
Okay, yes. Well, what I brought today is a poem by one of my favorite poets, James Schuyler, who was a terrific poet. He died a few years ago. And he was what the thing he did that was so great, and that this came out, I started reading him because a poet online suggested that rather than feel saturated and overwhelmed and psychically numbed by the news flow as that's continuously running about current events, that we turn to poems that were more about life than death. And that Schuyler's, one of his great poems is just called simply Hymn to Life. And what's particularly great about it and what's notable about the poem that I'll read is the tremendous attention that he pays to to everyday details, and to note, what he's great at is finding this mix of observations that are both very daily, that are quotidian, but also constantly the sense that there is something larger and more beautiful and more sublime around the edges. And so, in regard to the current moment, it's been much on my mind, and particularly teaching a writing class where I'm doing it now through Zoom. Thinking about what kind of writing prompts I can give the students who are all in isolation and tucked away in various places. And this idea of looking out your window, which the poem I'm going to read, and noticing things that you wouldn't have noticed previously. Schuyler was, when he wrote this poem, which is one of his it's an early poem, it's one of his best known poems, called February. He's a New York-based poet. He seldom left his apartment. In fact, in his later years, he lived in the Chelsea Hotel, and Patti Smith or Eileen Miles would drop by and drop off his groceries or something. But he he didn't get out much. But he was working on a poem, he says, that about a Renaissance painting, and he was working on it very hard, and it was very frustrating. It was going nowhere. It was kind of flat, but he was working on it. And then he just kind of looked out the window and started to write a different poem, and this is the poem he wrote. February. A chimney breathing a little smoke, the sun I can't see making a bit of pink. I can't quite see in the blue the pink of 5 tulips at 5 p.m. on the day before March 1st. The green of the tulip stems and leaves like something I can't remember, finding a jack in the pulpit a long time ago and far away. Why, it was December then, and the sun was on the sea by the temples we'd gone to see. One green wave moved in the violet sea like the UN building on big evenings, green and wet, while the sky turns violet. A few almond trees had a few flowers, like a few snowflakes out of the blue looking pink in the light. A gray hush in which the boxy trucks roll up 2nd Avenue into the sky. They're just going over the hill. The green leaves of the tulips on my desk like grass light on flesh, and a green copper steeple and streaks of cloud beginning to glow. I can't get over how it all works in together, like a woman who just came to her window and stands there filling it, jogging her baby in her arms. She's so far off. Is it the light that makes the baby pink? I can see the little fists and the rocking horse motion of her breasts. It's getting grayer and gold and chilly. 2 dog-sized lions face each other at the corners of a roof. It's the yellow dust inside the tulips. It's the shape of a tulip. It's the water in the drinking glass the tulips are in. It's a day like any other.
Thank you.
Talk about it.
Well, that's, I mean, that last phrase kind of says it all, a day like any other, and thinking about, the challenge of finding the beautiful in the daily and in the simple, some of the most simplest stimuli of light on leaves, water, weather, time, that notational particularity that for him becomes a kind of active transformation of your surroundings. And it's interesting to note that, I mean, Schuyler, not to get too, there's not a biography of him yet, but it's kind of well known and documented in his poems that he had stability issues. He was kind of psychically precarious and depended on friends to take care of him particularly in his later years. And he has incredible poems where he can kind of document his own psychic fragility. But the counterweight to that fragility is, as I think you can sense in that poem, the presence of the perceptions around him, and that he fought like the things that he notes are what anchor and transform his inner life and kind of are gestures towards stability and community, even when they are extremely private.
Thank you.
So mine is visual. Sorry, I'm going to do a share screen. Oh,
Yes. Oh, hold on. You should be able to do it now.
okay, thank you. Okay, it's not registering.
I think you click on share.
Yeah.
Here.
No, because then I'll get him.
But
Hold
use
on.
what's on your screen.
No, but what I want is, sorry, this is not.
That's okay. That's quite all right. That's quite all right.
One moment. There it is. Okay. Because otherwise I would have gotten his face. Are you seeing something called microbial mystique?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm a critic, not an artist, and I was going to talk about an Emily Dickinson poem, and which I want to recommend to everybody. Called the first line is "There is a solitude of sea," or maybe it's a solitude of space. I can't remember, but it's a really beautiful poem about solitude and contemplation. It ends, "A soul admitted to itself, finite infinity." But so I recommend that poem. But what I decided to talk about instead was my work is really about thinking about the messages we're getting from the media, from science, as it moves through popular culture. And this is a really amazing, this is a really, having a little technical difficulty. This is an amazing passage from Richard Preston's Hot Zone, which is about an Ebola outbreak in simians. And I thought I would look at it because, or talk about it because it's about seeing the art in the microbe. We have been talking a lot about microbial warfare, hearing a lot about thinking about this as the war with microbes. And I think there's a real problem with that metaphor because it takes away the human responsibility for creating a pandemic, as though the microbe is some thoughtful enemy. And so I think one of the things that art does is ask us to think differently about our surroundings, about our world. And so I wanted to think about the art that's made out of microbes, even at their most horrific, and what that can help us think about. So the quotation is in bold below. Looking into the electron microscope, the researcher who's working on Ebola saw white cobras tangled among themselves like the hair of Medusa. They were the face of nature herself, the obscene goddess revealed naked. This life form thing was breathtakingly beautiful. As he stared at it, he found himself being pulled out of the human world into a world where moral boundaries blur and finally dissolve completely. He was lost in wonder and admiration, even though he knew that he was the prey. And what I want to take from this is not to see beauty in the pandemic in any way, shape, or form, or in the microbe itself, but to think about what a microbe is on its own terms, what a virus is. It's not an enemy that is thoughtfully attacking us. What's happening is how we live in the world, and we need to think differently about that. So what happens if we think about what it means to live in the world with microbes that we're encountering because our development practices, our day-to-day practices are bringing us into contact with these different entities? And how does the art itself help us think about how we might think differently about inhabiting spaces with these things that can cause so much devastation and destruction? And so that's what I've been thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn your share off.
Yes, thank you.
And Ariana, please, what have you brought for us?
Yeah. So in thinking about kind of this question, I think I'm in a similar boat to Tracy in regards to it kind of shifting every day, the things that are kind of bringing me back to myself, I guess, in a way. And a lot of the art that I have, that I share, either pieces that I've created on my own or pieces that friends have created or have shared with me. And one of the kind of pieces that immediately came to mind, and I have two of them, is I have a friend who is a screen printer, and he also likes to make his own fonts and is very to music as well. And so as a gift, he gave me a screen print that he made, and it has lines from the dialogue, Why Worry? And it says, there should be sunshine after rain. There should be laughter after pain. Why worry now? Why worry? And it's in my bedroom across from my bed. So it's the first thing I see when I wake up in the morning. And I think it's especially poignant now in these spaces where it is sometimes hard to find laughter, to find sunshine, to find some sense of levity. And so it's a good daily reminder that those things do still exist in spite of what is going on around us. And so and it also then reminds me of him, because it is a piece that he created for me and music that we, shared together. And so it's like this feeling of being together, even though we physically can't be together as well. And then the other piece I have is, so I have a friend and he and I share quotes and poems back and forth with one another. Recently sent from a book called A Fierce Heart. And it says, we each carry within our hearts what is needed for the healing of our world at this time. It's the gift you came, and you will find your unique way to express it. Trust your innermost being. Trust in your true nature. My prayers are that you find your call to action. In spite of this world breaking my heart over and over, I love it with every ounce of my being. I signed on as a friend, and I hope that you do too. If you ever get lost, look at the path closely, then ask yourself one question. Does this path have heart? If it does, then follow it, friend. And I think that also just kind of really resonates with me at this time where it's really easy to feel lost and kind of pointless in the grand scheme of things because of how drastically our lives have changed. And it's just a reminder to kind of find that feeling of love and trust in yourself, but also in the around you, and how you can kind of share in that.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. That was great. I wanted to do that because I think it's nice to have that sort of, the term we used when I was in divinity school was the balm of Gilead. And it's this sort of salve that just heals. And I think that art really has that ability to heal us right now. I wanted to get into something Dr. Wald and I have been going back and forth about. And also I read a quote from her that was really poignant that I wanted to share. And I think this group would be really interested to hear your opinions on it. So Dr. Wald, I'm going to ask you, after I read the quote, to sort of expand on what you're saying and give us a little bit more info. And then I'd like everyone else to jump in. So the quote that it was from an ABC 11 interview you did. And it said, I think the language of crisis is one of the reasons we can't listen. And so it's really interesting to think that this gets to what Ariana does as well in SciComm, which is how do we form the language in such a way that people engage and listen to it? And it's so important in the arts that we do speak to people where they are. So could you expand a little bit on that? And then I'd love to have everyone else just jump in with your thoughts on what Dr. Wald has to say. Sure.
So I think there are two different aspects of that. And one of them is when the media is in a very tough spot of having to communicate the seriousness of what's happening around us so that we'll take responsibility and stay in place and do the things that we're asked to do without causing panic, which makes people stop listening entirely. So that's the more simple version. But what I think I was really getting at there was that when we're in the middle of a crisis, and we're thinking about crisis and survival. And we're thinking in terms of the immediacy, the outbreak happened. We don't think before that, and this gets to what I was doing with the art, we don't think about what it is that caused the outbreak and what it is that caused the outbreak to become a pandemic. So if we think about an outbreak as something that we don't think about until it happens, or pandemic until it happens, the solutions, how we have to think about that are, what are happening: vaccine, quarantine, pharmaceuticals, crisis mentality. But when this is over, what kind of story are we going to tell about what we've been through? And I hope we'll look at it at a bigger scale. So what is it what are the conditions that are causing this problem in the first place? And that involves how we live in the world. And this is something that I think art really helps us to see. How, what are the inequities? What breaks in the system is this problem showing us? And in my work, in a larger context, what I talk about is the ways in which global poverty and geopolitical inequities, our day-to-day practices, have put us in the situation where we not only encounter these microbes, how we're moving into spaces human beings haven't inhabited and so on. So we're encountering these microbes, but also how our practices are allowing them to spread in the way that we do. For instance, not having universal access to healthcare, having susceptible populations that can't resist this or contain it when it happens, having the kinds of global interconnectedness that we're not living in responsibly. And needing to think about how to live more socially responsibly in the world and so on, not only with our microbes, but especially compassionately, humanely with each other. I don't know if that made any sense, but.
It made great sense. Does anyone, if anyone would like to follow up, otherwise I'd have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Wald.
Okay, just to clarify, so not thinking just in terms of crisis and survival, but how we want to live more responsibly.
All right, well, I will follow up with my question, which is another quote, this time from your book. And this one I want to lay out, I want to talk about the narratives, as you said, that come out of this, the narratives that are generated. I think we all have heard by now that, Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the pandemic. And I thought Tracy and I were talking about Tony Kushner, Angels in America, post-HIV AIDS epidemic in the United States. And so you talk about in your book this idea of a possible loss of humanity conceived as the theft of mind and body. So I guess, and that's a reference a lot to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which you reference a lot in there. And this idea that the body snatchers are invisible, right? For a long period of time, they don't know what is happening. So the loss of humanity that you're talking about, is that a loss of humanity because we fail to connect to the broader sense of the human experience, or is does the virus literally have this power to pull humanity away from us, to sort of yank it from our being, if you will?
No, I don't want to animate the virus. The virus just is this thing in the world. The loss of humanity is how we feel about each other. And I think about contagion itself as a really amazing and powerful metaphor or analog for what it means to be human. So it reminds us that we are social beings. We have a profound need for each other. This is what we're all missing, and everybody talked about it just now, and art, I think, will be very much about it. What it means not to be able to hug people, what it means not to be able to shake hands and touch people. That is so much part of our culture. And to me, that's the thing I most miss. In Iceland, they're telling people who live alone to go out and hug a living entity, a tree. And that's, I actually had that thought that if I lived alone, I would be out hugging trees. Seriously, if I didn't have a pet or a person. Just a living thing. And I'm really serious about that. And so I think it tells us that we're social beings. We have a profound need for each other, but we're also dangers to each other. And I think there's a real, we're dangers literally in that we carry germs that can affect each other. It's just a fact. but we're also dangers in another sense. And I think the inhumanity that we have witnessed around us, we've witnessed tremendous compassion and humanity and community. But when I think about the Supreme Court telling people in Wisconsin they have to go out and vote, I'm stunned by the inhumanity. And I think there's a real danger when we think about each other as dangerous to get into an us-them, to get into a vilifying people and making people forgetting each other's humanity. And so that's what I was getting at.
Absolutely. So this actually gets directly to Ariana and Tracy's work. Ariana, your podcast, some might not say it's a work of art. I view it as a comedy podcast that talks about sports because I think you guys are very funny. It's based entirely, while you record, at home, it's based entirely on this communal sports activity that's going on. And Tracy, your work is obviously live theater. You can't do it without an audience, a cast, a crew. So you're seeing this pulling away from humanity. How is that affecting, the worlds that you two live in? And what do you see as a way to fight against that? As, we can't do live theaters. We can't do live sports. So how do we connect with one another? Dr. Wald talking about hugging a tree. I love that. I might go out and hug a tree. I have a dog, so I hug my dog a lot. But how does that affect your worlds? Tracy, go ahead first. Sorry.
I think the question kind of has two parts. There's how it affects my world right now and how it's going to affect my world in the next chapter. I think one thing that I'm sure is happening to artists of all kinds in this space of aloneness is this sort of thinking about what they want to make when they leave these places they're in. And I think some sort of subtle fear I have is that we'll find ourselves back in the systems that existed before, and we won't be able to maintain a sense of what we want to make when we come out of these places, or even know what it looks like, bound by economic needs of theater companies needing to sell tickets and make money, how the tension between what we want to make and how we want to articulate back the human experience of where we've been, which is what art does so often, in that sort of embodiment of life and life circumstances. How do we maintain a sense of that given the economic and fear constraints that will come next? There's lots of articles floating around in American Theater Magazine, and Colleen Dillon on her website just did a lot of data about what people are going to be comfortable doing. Will they go to museums? Will they go to art exhibits? And what are the factors? And the question isn't so much, which I'm really thankful for, what I'm about to say I'm really thankful for, the question isn't so much that whether or not these things are important to our humanity. People aren't questioning that, which I love that the data is pointing that way. We're not saying that art is ineffective or unnecessary. Actually, people are finding it's all over the internet. The National Theater is streaming plays. The Globe Theater is streaming plays. Your local artists are getting together and reading plays and posting them on Facebook. Yo-Yo Ma is playing the cello every day. Lin-Manuel Miranda, Stephen Schwartz. I mean, they're just all over social media. We're absorbing art every day in an attempt to regulate and balance our lives. So it's not about it being unnecessary. It's about, when will I feel safe to be in an enclosed space sitting next to another person? And I don't think we know the answer to that. And I don't think people know the answer to that. So, do you sell fewer seats and sit everybody 1 seat away from each other and provide hand sanitizer at the door when they leave? I don't know what it looks like, I guess. I think what I do know is that I don't think we can come out of this time and just sort of rearrange the chairs. Like, I think that we really have to think about this pause is space to make a plan. And there's lots of arguments about take the space you need, you don't have to be working, and that's very true. And if you can't, or you're in a space where you just need to sit at home on the floor with your dog and watch Netflix, that's okay if that's where you are. But for those who aren't, we need to be thinking about what comes next, about the plan to come back stronger, to come back more resilient. If there are systems that need addressed or looked at, now's a great time. If every organization is now going to be a startup when this is over, how do we want to start? And I think that those questions can really fuel us and excite us, those that are in the creative class, whether that's in technology or science or the arts, to make a plan, to think about, and hold on to what we discover in this space of isolation that we want to make next, and trying to figure out how we hold on to that.
Yeah, we get
important.
We get a reset here where we get to decide what we want art to look like after this.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. Ariana, I would love to hear your perspective on what Dr. Wald was saying as well.
Yeah, I think in kind of reflecting on this and reflecting on this in the spaces that I kind of operate in, not just with the podcast and the sports world that I'm a part of, but then also thinking about the art exhibit that I curate, and then another exhibit that I was in the process of curating when all of this stuff kind of began. And I think one of the things that across the board this is really highlighted, and Dr. Wald alluded to this before, is how important people are in the process of these things, right? So when this was starting, sporting events, for college basketball, they were heading into tournament time, and there were several different conferences who had their conference tournaments going. They were like, okay, we can do this, but we can't have fans in the building. And like, I think that highlighted in kind of seeing some of those games and like experiencing what is it like when you have this thing is still happening, this performance is still happening, but the people who are there watching it are no longer a part of it. And so I think it really highlighted the importance of that kind of human element being in the building that kind of breathes life into this performance or this thing happening. And, similarly reflecting on the art exhibits, right? It's a very similar thing where it's like, well, yes, we have these pieces that we've curated and pulled together, but we don't have a space for them to be in, and we don't have people who are kind of living, breathing, walking through and experiencing these pieces either. And so I think it, like, yes, it does, it forces us into this conversation of thinking about how is it that we act towards one another when we are with one another, and how is it that the systems that we live in are operating to affect some of us more than others. I think across the board, this has very widely showed the fragility of the systems that we have in place, and is kind of sparking those different conversations. But there are still aspects of this that are causing, polarization in different pockets as well, right? So you can think about that with the movements that are calling to reopen the country, because right now the economic close is affecting different groups of people disproportionately, as is kind of the burden of where sickness is and where sickness isn't. And so it's interesting to kind of see this duality of, in some of these senses, it is really highlighting this kind of collective humanity and the need that we all have to be together to experience these different things together, but then simultaneously the different things that actually have either historically kept us separated or are currently and actively keeping us separated too. And I saw, and I won't, dive into this too deeply, but I also think that even though it is not necessarily thought of as art, social media and the things that people who are like on social media and are being pushed to create on social media, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, it is also kind of become the space where people are trying to find community and trying to have different creative outlets too, which I think is really fascinating. But I saw a tweet the other day, and it says, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but all of us need to grieve the life we once knew by shifting into radical acceptance of our present reality. There's no normal to return to, and if we're honest, the pace of our former lives was abnormal." And so it kind of calls out this fact that, yes, once we eventually, right, when this wave of the virus stops, when we have the different precautions in place that we need to be out in the world again, the way we think about ourselves in that world is going to look radically different than how it used to look. And so this, oh, I can't wait for things to go back to normal, isn't actually what's going to happen. And so we are going to have to rethink, well, how do we space people in this venue for this type of event? Is it cool? So like, you know, sports, the way they cram students in the student section for games, like, is that a safe thing? Is that not a safe thing? So it kind of is questioning some of these traditions or ways that we have of doing things, as to whether or not this is the best choice for us.
Mm.
Can I jump in there?
Absolutely, please, but both of you.
I think that's great because, but I also want to say that a crisis by definition is a turning point. It came from medicine. That's what it means. And we have an opportunity here to tell a very different story about the world. So while it's true, we have to accept we're not going back to normal. I'm glad I'm sorry about a lot of things. We're not going back to normal, of the human contact, all of that, but we shouldn't go back to the way we were doing things. And I think, you know, what Ariana was saying about life being too fast paced and inequities in the world, right? We should be using this to see what's broken in our system. And here's an opportunity to restart and fix it. That's the silver lining. And I'm hanging on to a silver lining. What if positive change comes out of this too? We can make that happen. We can live differently and more compassionately and think about what needs changing. So that's the good.
Yeah, that in a lot of things that the Milton Friedman, seems odd to quote him, but his quote is floating around in lots of places, right, where he says, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are just lying around. And so to take that idea and say, and to have your eyes open in a fresh way to say, what's lying around in my sphere of influence, in the things that I can change, in the space that I occupy, what's next? And not just let next happen passively, but be active participants in what's next from all of our little corners of the world, whatever that might be.
Yeah. And if I can kind of jump on that last point too, I think it's been interesting to see particularly in like the artistic community, how like they've stepped into that role of like, how can we start to communicate what's next and how we can be, right? And kind of help in imagining that future and starting to kind of present that future to people of, yes, this is where we are right now, but can we create a positive narrative in some way out of this, right? So that's been a really beautiful thing to see in kind of this really difficult time.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And thinking small as well as big, right? That one of the things that I've noticed is I'm paying so much more attention to details that I hadn't stopped to see, the different greens that are out right now, the colors, the on my little walk that I can take every morning, I'm seeing things that so much more clearly and paying attention to what they're telling me. And I don't just mean in nature, but in how people are interacting in positive ways. We can change the details of our lives and rethink how we've occupied the world in very small ways as well as big. And I think one of the things that's going to come out in art is so much about paying attention to detail, right? One of the things that's going to come out in art is things people are seeing in all different meanings of that word that they weren't seeing when they weren't forced to sit in place for a while. And I do think about the Emily Dickinson poem I was going to read, the soul admitted to itself, finite infinity. That's an amazing concept. That's where we are right now. We're admitting our souls to ourselves and thinking.
Yeah. That brings up, I'm glad you ended with Emily Dickinson, because it brings up a question I have for Dr. Donahue, which you are sort of in this circle, the only person who can really create in much of the same way you have before with your poetry, right? How has this shifted your process and even the work that you're putting out? Do you see a noticeable shift in the work that you are working on right now in terms of the tone and the things that you are identifying and talking about in your poetry?
I would have to say it's probably, I wish I could say that, yeah, but my writing practice, and given that I'm essentially of a kind of melancholy and apocalyptic temperament, it's kind of, you know, it's not that it hasn't affected me, but my writing is the same. I write every day, and but I also take several years to finish anything. But one of the things I am certainly aware of is like what one does with the kind of most immediate details of our situation and what kind of resonance they have, but also how deadening they can be if one isn't very careful about how to kind of preserve what is truly shocking, or to make it shocking in a way that is true to, you know, what Blake calls the minute particulars of the situation. And so that it is, so that I find myself, if not resisting certain kinds of information that come, because I get up and I write, I guess basically run through what's left of my short-term memory every morning and say, you know, what did I dream? What did I read? What did I taste? What did someone say to me? What did I, you know, all this kind of to see what's there. But to kind of measure and, you know, be somewhat critical of, you know, stuff from the news, say. Not that one doesn't register it, but one wants to be a sensitive instrument to, you know, in the registering of the social and natural world around one. And that means also kind of guarding against being manipulated by details. So, you know, I won't know for probably a number of years quite how it's, you know, affecting me, but I certainly, you know, I'm aware of what's going on. I mean, I read far too many newspapers and things. So that's, you know, that becomes an aesthetic issue too. It's like, how do you know, what do you see as the heart of the situation in the moment?
Yeah, that gets to a question I want to sort of touch on with everyone in your respective fields: Ariana, visual art, Tracy, theater, and Dr. Wald, literature, and Dr. Donahue, poetry. Looking at the history, and Dr. Wald, obviously this is where all of your, you know, a lot of your work is what art, if you were going to sort of use your creativity and go, you know, a little bit into the future here, what art and what do we see as the themes that are going to come out of this? Dr. Wald, you talk about the idea of out of communism, the idea of this, you know, the invasion of the body snatchers, the silent invader, and anybody can be one of them. And that's obviously not a pandemic, but what do we see in your various fields? And Dr. Wald, I'll ask you to start from history that gives us a view into the future of your field.
It's a great question. So, I mean, I think actually, and by the way, Priscilla and Joe is fine. I mean, I think the invasion of the body snatchers actually is in a way about a pandemic. I mean, maybe not literally, but the idea, and in fact, the second film version came out in 1978. It was right before the HIV pandemic. And one of the first things one of the journalists said about the pandemic, about HIV, is it was like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where everybody was looking at everybody else saying, could you be one of them? So I think we will get more zombie apocalypse and, you know, this kind of thing in a certain kind of pop culture. But if I'm thinking about the art that Joe was talking about, and I was thinking about Joe's poetry, and he said it, but I was going to say to him, you won't know how this affected you until for a few years until we're looking back. And I do think it's going to be at the level of the detail. That's what artists are so amazing at, being able to just convey how the day-to-day changed. And I think we can sit here and wonder, and we can talk about what it feels like to have our interactions be online and not in person and all of that, but we're not going to know how it changed us for a while. And it will have changed us, and it will make us think differently about the day-to-day, about the detail, about the minute detail. And that's really where the most profound change happens. So again, I'm interested in social change and the big picture, and will we please finally have universal access to healthcare, that kind of thing. Can we begin to think seriously about geopolitical inequities, global poverty? Please, we need to. Will this help us do that? But it's at the day-to-day that our practices will change. And how they'll change, I think we're just going to see the world differently. I don't know yet. I'm excited to find out, and I'm hopeful.
Absolutely. Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
Geez. Well, they tend to go in a somewhat different direction. I was just thinking, and I don't want to. I'm not going to read this poem because it's not mine. It hasn't been published yet, but it's by, to me, one of the greatest living poets in English, a poet named Ed Roberson, lives out in Chicago. He's about 80 years old. I just want to quote one. So this is quote one line from it, thinking about other capacities poetry has to address plagues and dire circumstance. And that is kind of, it's the other side of the joyous particular. It's the grievous, elegiac, and accusatory particular of apocalyptic and prophetic writing, where part of what poetry can do is to name the demons who cause this, or who have immediately caused. And I don't think we need to go too far to find a healthy list of them. But this poem is a sonnet about packing up some furniture. This is an older man packing up. He's paying tremendous attention to the things he's packing up, and then the news breaks in about the president. He says he calls him a slyly blameless, lethal dealer. Who is and compares our moment to plagues in 13th century Europe. But the line I want to point to is this line. He goes right at the end of the sonnet: "All the people going to die are like me." And I feel like this line there's just an angry but compassionate truth about about drawing identity between the sick and dying, and the particular, that perception has found someone who is, an older person, so is among the precarious, but that the coming home of that detail in that poem seems to me doing one of the other great things that poetic art and representational art can do, which is to not just kind of make one more compassionate, but to particularly see those people going to die are like me. And what proceeds from that perception is, I think, the kind of thing that will touch poetry and the arts in various ways to come. And the specific anger of that poem, like this is just someone who's living their life. This is not an overtly political poem, but it can't not be, because the politics have reached into the person's home and threatened their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. But, the radical empathy is what we need from the arts right now, and especially after this, I think. Ariana, what does this look like for visual? Oh, looks like we lost Ariana. Well, hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us. Tracy, we've talked a lot about art out of tragedy. Just to share a brief anecdote, when I was in school, Tracy was directing a show called Crimes of the Heart, and it's about domestic violence. And we had a domestic violence incident that affected our campus. And you were very compassionate, but emphatic that we needed to keep doing this because we needed to present this presence of this person who has been the victim of domestic violence to help to heal this community. So do you see, it looks like Ariana is coming back in, do you see the same things coming out of this in terms of that radical empathy, that presence that we talked about?
It's hard for me. I have a hard time articulating what theater is going to look like. The writing that comes out of this space, it's for theater as well as lots of other art forms, the audience is an absolute necessity. And so I think in this space, theater artists of all kinds are finding ways to think about the modes of theater in different ways, which is fascinating and interesting. I think we're kind of stepping out of a box, and the fact that publishing companies are making or breaking down royalty rights agreements so people can live stream plays, and I mean, these are incredible things by a market-driven kind of systems and entities of publishing firms. You know, it's just really interesting to watch some of the walls come down. I, like Dr. Wald, I am hopeful that we look at these walls being down and we go, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. I don't necessarily know what that means.
Well, we've talked a lot, Tracy, about people being priced out of theater. I mean, Broadway, Broadway
Right.
on its own, but even just your local, you go up here to the DPAC and you want to see, and we've talked about how maybe finally we can get some people into the theater who've been gone for so long because they've been priced out.
Right. And, it's even difficult for the nonprofit theater company who goes into a community that wants to serve a particular population, and suddenly, because of the demands of theater making and what it costs, the very people they're trying to serve are priced out of the opportunity to serve them. It's just, there's a lot of tension there. I think it was Plato who said that the contemplation of beauty causes the soul to grow wings. And I pray that's true. Like I don't know what the wings look like, but I really think that we're gonna have to think beyond and what's next and shape that. But I think that calls us to something actively in the present of our present contemplation. Years ago, I ran across this book by a Jesuit called The Sacrament of the Present Moment, and it shaped how I think about my now. He was charged in 1731 to be a spiritual director for the nuns of visitation in France, and he wrote this book about what does it mean to stay present to your own self, to look at your own, like where you are, to look at God, to look at the surroundings, and that there's something really valuable about now that if I pay attention to it can shape tomorrow. That if I pay attention to this, and sacrament being something that's holy, right, set apart. So the holiness, if we can even think about the spaces of isolation that we're in, to be this space to contemplate beauty, to contemplate where we are, to contemplate our own souls and the systems that work in the world, and say, how does me showing up for my life today, looking at where I am and what's happening, gonna shape what happens next? I've been thinking about what plays do I want to do? What's the next play that somebody should want to come see? And because in May, I will announce a season for 2021 for my students.
Yeah, no, that's...
What I was gonna do in February, I don't think I want to do anymore. But I don't know what that means. And I don't know what I'm looking at. But I'm looking, and I'm reading, and I'm contemplating. And I think that artists probably all over the world are doing the same thing. And that gives me great hope.
You could do the secret garden again.
I could.
It's about cholera. Ariana, last word goes to you. What does this mean for visual art, for gallery spaces?
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think a lot of them kind of nestle in this ability to reflect the complexity of where we are, how we're feeling, and what's going on, and not just in a kind of large scale societal sense, but in the like small scale, really human sense. So like being able to capture that juxtaposition of, you know, being isolated but still in companionship in some way, or this notion of being connected digitally but also still feeling this pang of loneliness. And so I think it's really kind of highlighting the just varied nature of like human emotion and our ability to experience so many of them at a given time. And I think by and large for people, that's a really hard thing to kind of rest and sit with, that like multitude of feelings, because it's like, well, one of these things should win out, but sometimes that's not the case, right? If I am, you know, sitting upstairs and playing with my dog, there might be extreme joy in that moment and what he's doing, but then simultaneously there's this feeling of, I don't have another person to share in this with me, or, you know, and so I think there is that really remarkable chance to kind of, in regards to visual arts, any kind of art, really to draw on that complexity, and not just solely from the artist perspective, but from the audience perspective, because we've now lived in this space where we've been forced to confront it and acknowledge it, because we can't run outside and go do a million things to distract us from all of these different emotions. We do have to kind of sit with it. And so I think it's going to bring a uniqueness to the experience of art and more kind of human experience to draw on. And so I feel like the art that comes out of this period of time is going to be for like everybody who is living through it. When we experience that art, I feel like the depth of emotion and the depth of connection we feel to it is going to be so intense for us, because it's going to draw on these things that we can, you know, recall sitting through and experiencing. And so I think there's going to be a lot of power to that, which I think is going to be really deeply fascinating. And I've also thought about this just in regards to, so I use a lot of art in the classroom when I'm working with students in a lot of different ways. And so some of that is giving students the ability to create things. And so I've thought about that in regards to different things. So recently, one of my classes, they just finished doing podcasts, and we screened the podcasts in class. And then, you know, the class was able to feedback. It was interesting to see. So there was one student who her podcast was about coronavirus and kind of what's going on right now, and this kind of societal critique of what's happening. And she drew historically from experiences and accounts of the 1918 flu pandemic. And the way that she went about producing her podcast was very much like a radio, like, you know, War of the Worlds when it came out on the radio. It had that same sort of very like serious feel to it. And so I don't know, I think it's going to be really fascinating, the things that get created as a result of this, in the ways in which we respond to it, for having, you know, lived through this kind of very unique and weird situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank my panelists. It was wonderful to get, as Ariana said, to see some human faces and to get to talk about something other than coronavirus, talk about a little art for a while. So thank you everyone for joining us. Be sure to join us on Monday, the 20th. We're going to be discussing with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, and Major General Charles Dunlap Jr. about the effect of coronavirus on the military. And please head over to our website to check out all of the programs that we have, including our master's program. If you're interested in science, tech, the intersection of those two, and ethics and policy, please head on over. We would love to we'd love to chat with you about the program and how it fits with your goals as scientists and as ethicists. And please join us for our next conversation. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.